Hey everyone, in this video we are going to look at what it takes to set up a Windows computer for use in web development. A lot of what we cover here may make absolutely no sense at all, and to be honest, that's totally okay. We used to walk students through understanding each part of this setup process, but in the end everybody just forgot it and it really wasn't that helpful. So a lot of the setup is actually going to be delegated to a bash script that will run in our terminal, and it will kind of hide a lot of the implementation details, so you won't really have to worry about it. Setting up for web development on a Windows machine is a little bit different than on a Linux or on a Mac, only because of the way that the terminal is used. Truth be told, you could use the regular Windows terminal and operating system just fine, but it's really common in the web development world on a Windows machine to set it up using something called the Windows subsystem for Linux. On this video, I'm going to include all of the links that you see me go to, so you won't have to worry about Googling for things the same way that I'm going to do in the video. And what I've done here is essentially created a fresh install of Windows 10 on this computer. So the very first thing we're going to do, which is pretty easy, is I'm going to open a browser and I'm going to just download VS Code. So I'm just going to search for download VS Code. And it's this first one here. Again, I'll include the link to this, but because I'm on a Windows machine, I'm going to use this installer. And that should be downloading automatically. In my case, I just need to run the executable. Okay, and this is the kind of setup thing. I can close this. I'm going to accept the agreement and just run through regular setup process. I will like to add a desktop icon and then check all of these options, and I will continue the install. All right, that is done. I actually don't need to launch VS Code quite yet, so I will finish that. Okay, that was pretty painless. Let's jump into the next part. This is going to require a little bit more of the technical things. So I'm going to open my Edge again, and I'm going to search for install WSL for Windows 10. And it's going to be this one by the Microsoft team in the Microsoft Docs. So I will click that. Again, I'll include this link for you. Now the instructions on this page are actually pretty good. I understand it's not going to be super simple for someone who isn't familiar with kind of the developer tools on a Windows machine, so I'm going to walk you through it. First thing is it says to open PowerShell as administrator and to run this command. So I'm going to just copy this by clicking that button, and I like to open my programs just by clicking on the Windows icon down here or clicking the Windows button and just start typing because it's going to search for it automatically. So I'm going to search for PowerShell, all one word, and you'll see right here is the PowerShell option. I can't just click it because it tells me to run it as an administrator, so I'm going to right click it and go up to run as administrator. This is going to pop up a black screen where I'm going to just click yes. I click yes and it brings up the PowerShell and I'm in it as an administrator. Again, this doesn't need to make total sense. That's totally fine. I had already copied this command right there, so I'm just going to hit Control V to paste, and I'm going to hit Enter to submit that command. This is going to install some things, and that was pretty quick. While I have this open, because I have the most recent version of Windows, which I highly recommend you get as well, I'm going to update to the second version of Windows Subsystem for Linux. That's what WSL stands for. I would highly recommend updating to the latest version so that you can just do this. WSL 2 is supposed to be quite a bit faster. If you're not sure which version you're on, you can follow these steps. But since I know that I have the most recent version, I am going to copy this next command and just paste it in like I did before. Control V. And hit Enter. Once you see that that operation has completed successfully, the next thing you need to do is restart your machine. So I'm going to restart so these changes can take effect, and I will be right back. All right, I restarted my machine. I'm going to go back to the same place I was at before, which was install WSL for Windows 10. And I am going to scroll down. Now I can do this command to set the WSL version 2 as my default version. Again, this doesn't have to make sense. If this is totally confusing, that is 100% okay. Just kind of follow the steps here and you should be fine. Okay, I'm going to copy that. Again, I have to open PowerShell, so I'm going to type PowerShell, and then I have to open it as an administrator. So I will right-click, Run as Administrator. Okay, then I can just paste in the command I copied, and it looks like that works just fine. As I'm editing this video, I noticed that I failed to mention something. When I run this command, this WSL set default version 2, you'll notice that there's a whole paragraph here dedicated to a possible error message that could pop up. When I first did this, it actually gave me this message, WSL2 requires an update to its kernel component. And because I had gone through and fixed this, it didn't show up when I was recording this. It's a pretty easy fix. All you have to do is click on the link here. And then from here, really all you have to do is click this download the latest WSL2 Linux kernel and follow these little instructions. It's pretty quick. And then as soon as you complete those steps, you can try running this command again. Assuming everything went well installing that kernel component, running this command should not be a problem at all, and it should just jump to the next line and be ready for you to type in the next command. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of just continue down in this tutorial. It says that you can install your Linux distribution of choice. Fortunately, there's a handy link here to open the Microsoft Store. And I have this showing here probably because I've done it before. If you don't have this, which I don't think you will, you'll probably look more like this. In the search, just search for Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U. Don't worry about these ones with the versions. The one that does not have the version will always be the most updated one. So at the time of recording, 20.04 was recently released. If I choose this Ubuntu, it's going to be the 20.04 version, as you can see right down here. So I'm going to click Install. Now, I don't personally have a Microsoft account. You're welcome to log in here if you want. I don't want to create one at this time, so I can just close this box. There may be some benefits to actually logging into your Windows account. I actually don't really know offhand. Okay, that finished, so I'm going to launch it. And what this is doing is it's essentially installing a Linux subsystem on your Windows machine. So like it says, this may take a few minutes. Okay, so for me that actually did take a few minutes, so don't be too worried if this takes a little while. Now this step is really important. It's asking you to enter a new Unix username. This really can be anything you want. For me, I'm just going to keep this simple and I'm just going to type Bob. Then it's going to ask me for a password. This is essentially my pseudo password or my administrator password for this Bob account. Now, when using Terminal, you're going to see that this happens a lot when it asks for a password, and it's going to look like nothing is typing. So right now I am typing my own password, and it looked like nothing happened, but that's just a security feature. It really is typing. If you make a mistake, you can just hit backspace a bunch of times, like more times than the characters you typed, and start over. I'll hit enter. I'll type my password again. Awesome. Okay, this essentially put me into a Unix terminal, a Unix shell, or rather a Linux shell. And at this point, I could continue by just using this Linux installation, this Ubuntu program, which gives me access to my file system. But Windows has released its own version of Terminal, which is not PowerShell, but a kind of a newer version, which actually is pretty good. Also, Visual Studio Code has its own integrated terminal that we are going to set up so that it can also be using the kind of Unix system instead of the one that comes with a Windows machine normally. So I'm going to install, I'm going to search for Windows Terminal, and there's a regular one and a preview one. If you're feeling adventurous, you could do the preview one. I'm just going to do the regular one here. I'm going to install that. Again, I don't need my Microsoft account. And I will launch that. If you are going to use this version of Windows Terminal, it's going to be important that you understand that it will automatically open you in Windows PowerShell, which is like this PowerShell that we were using earlier. However, if you want to do anything with web development and using that Windows subsystem for Linux setup, you are going to want to open a new tab with this drop-down arrow and choose Ubuntu. And then I can go ahead and close this PowerShell. Okay, now that we've set that up, let's go ahead and close our Windows Store, or rather the Microsoft Store. And let's go ahead and open Visual Studio Code. Now this has happened for me every time I've done this setup. Visual Studio Code will recommend a plugin called RemoteWSL. And I would definitely go ahead and install this. We're going to need this as we do web development on a Windows machine. So I'm going to click Install. And if you did not see that little alert, you can click down here in your extensions icon, and you can just search for Remote-WSL. And it's going to be probably this top one. It's made by Microsoft. It has many downloads, so this is definitely the right one. Now when I clicked install there, it installed it for me, but if that wasn't there for you and you had to search for it, there will just be a little install button that you'll click right here. Now, in Visual Studio Code, there is an integrated terminal that you can get to by clicking Terminal, New Terminal, or you can open it by, this says Control-Shift backtick. I've always only had to do Control backtick. I think there might be a slight difference, but you'll notice that the default one here is PowerShell. What you should do is click on this drop-down and say Select Default Shell, and then change this to WSL Bash. This is going to make it so that when you create a new terminal, which I can do by clicking plus, instead of using PowerShell, it's going to use that Ubuntu installation that we set up just now. I can switch back over to PowerShell and close it by clicking the trash icon. Now, I'm going to be honest, I found this instruction somewhere. I'm not entirely sure what it does, but the first time you use this, you should type code space dot. Now, what I do know is that this command, code space dot, can be used in the future to open something in Visual Studio Code. In fact, I'll show you that in just a second. Right now, I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to install something and download something. Again, I'm not 100% sure what it's doing. Looks like it opened a new Visual Studio window, so I'm just going to close the old one, make this one bigger. And actually, what I'll do is from here, I'm going to CD into my desktop, which again, you may not have learned about CD yet. That's okay. I'm changing directory into my desktop, and I can say code space dot, and that is a command to open Visual Studio Code in the current directory, or rather open the desktop directory in Visual Studio Code. And so I have a couple things here, like a couple shortcuts that are called links for Microsoft Edge and Visual Studio Code, whatnot. Those are just over here on my desktop. Usually you'll be opening an actual project folder, but I don't have any of those quite yet. Okay, I believe that's everything for Visual Studio Code for now. I'm going to close those. And the next step is to run that bash script that I mentioned. It's one that we at vSchool have written to kind of delegate all the tedious, mundane installation process things to a script that just does it automatically for you. Again, I'll include a link to this, but I'm going to go to coursework.vschool.io. And I know, because I wrote it, that there's an article called Computer Setup for vSchool. I'll scroll down here, and it talks about the automatic setup with the bash script. So I'm going to triple click this to make sure I get the entire thing, hit Control-C to copy it, and over in here I will paste it and hit enter. Now, one thing that will be very helpful for you is to make sure you read all of the text here. It will have a lot of really helpful clues that will get you through this setup process. Here it says I should hit return or enter. It's asking for my first and last name, so I can type that in. And now this is a pretty common thing. As it mentioned up above, you may be prompted to enter your sudo password. This is the password that you chose when you were setting up this Ubuntu Linux installation. If you remember, I chose the username Bob, which is why this is Bob down here. And then I typed that password and confirmed that password where it looked like nothing was typing. The same thing is going to happen here. I'm going to type in my password and it will look like nothing is happening, but it really is. I'll hit enter and it is downloading and setting up a number of things. I won't make you sit through this, so I will fast forward to when this finishes. And actually, before I do that, here it's asking if I want to continue. I can just hit Y for yes and hit enter. Okay, once you see this blue text again, it means that we are back at the script. It's done installing the things it was installing. So like it says, I will hit return. Okay, and in my case, because this is a fresh install of Windows, I don't have an SSH file yet. Again, you don't need to know what an SSH file is or anything like that, but what's important here is that I use the correct email address that I used for my GitHub account. The script will open up the correct page for you, so I can just hit enter. It will open the page. Now I need to log into my GitHub account. And this will open me to my GitHub account's emails settings. Basically the one that's listed as primary, I just want to copy that, go back to my script here, which is welcoming me back, and paste in my email address. And I can hit enter. It's double checking that I have it correct. I'll say yes. Awesome, and it generated a new SSH key for me. I'll hit return, and it copied that SSH key to the clipboard, and now hitting enter again will open the place that I need to put that key. Here I can choose a title that is going to be indicative of the machine I'm using. So maybe I'll say Bob's Windows 10 machine. It doesn't really matter what you put here as long as you put something meaningful to this machine. I will then paste in my SSH key. It's fine that this is on its own line. It had to wrap because it thinks this is one giant string. And you'll notice that my email address got put at the very end of that. So I will add my SSH key. And awesome, we can go back to our script. The next step it says is it's going to install Homebrew. Again, I can just hit enter. And here the Homebrew installation instructions are asking me to press enter again, so I will do that. And this is something else that might take a minute or two to finish. Okay, we're back to the blue text, so it means that this step completed. It does have some next steps here, but the bash script should have completed those for you automatically. So we can just hit enter to move on, and it's going to install the Node version manager. I can just hit enter again. Okay, that's done pretty quickly, and now it's going to use the Node version manager to install Node.js. So I'll hit enter again. Okay, that was pretty quick, and enter again. And that's basically it. Hopefully that was a pretty painless process. Like it says, the next thing to do is just to close out of this terminal window, and then I can open it again and everything should be set up. Let's give it a try. I'll close this. I don't think I need that anymore. This time I'm going to use Visual Studio Code's built-in terminal. It doesn't really matter that it's the Visual Studio Code one. I could also open that Windows terminal program that I downloaded as long as I use the Ubuntu version of it. And I should be able to say node --version, and it gives me a version number. If something did not work in that setup script, it would have said something like bash node command not found or something like that. There are still a few more things that we need to do to really get your computer set up for use in web development. Something you may have come across when you were looking at some of this documentation is the section that says you should use the Linux file system for faster performance. You're welcome to pause and read through this or go to the website and read through it, but essentially what it's saying is that you should always store your actual project files inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux instead of trying to use something on your regular Windows file system. This might not make a whole lot of sense on its face, so let's just take a look at that really quick. I'm going to open Windows Terminal, And you'll see that, first of all, it starts me in Windows PowerShell, which we already talked about how I can get to the Windows subsystem for Linux using this Ubuntu version. But you'll notice that it's putting me by default inside of the C drive, which is my hard drive, and then a folder called users, and then a folder called Bob. This represents my home directory. And from here, I could change directory into like the desktop, for example. And now I'm accessing things on the desktop. This desktop really is just a visual representation of another folder on my machine. Okay, maybe you are used to putting something inside of, for example, your documents folder. Well, your documents folder, I'll just open my file explorer, I'll go to this PC, and here's my documents. This might be where you're used to, say, putting files, or maybe where you were planning on putting all of your web development stuff. For example, creating a new folder called development, maybe. Well, according to what we just saw, we are not going to want to access these kinds of files from the Windows file system, but instead we want to use the Linux file system. So just to avoid confusion, I'm going to delete this folder, and I'm not actually going to be using anything on the Windows file system. The reason is the second version of Windows Subsystem for Linux, if you remember we installed version 2 or we upgraded to version 2, it does a very poor job of accessing the Windows file system. It can be very slow. We've had one of our past students say that they thought their computer was broken when they were accessing Windows file stuff from within the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So the best thing for us to do is to just get used to storing our web development project files inside of the Linux system instead of the Windows file system. So the first thing I want to do is make it very easy to access my project files from the Windows file system or the file explorer here. Now there is a pretty convoluted and difficult way to dive into the folder structure here to find your Linux home folder. But there's a fairly simple way, and that is just in this address bar here, I'm going to type // WSL $, and hit enter. And this should take you inside of your network, and there should be a folder that is essentially called WSL $. And depending on how you installed your Linux subsystem, you should either have Ubuntu or Ubuntu 18.04 or 20.04, or if you chose a totally different distribution like Red Hat or something like that, it would probably say that here. So I'm going to double click on this Ubuntu folder, and inside of here is essentially my root folder. This is the root of my Linux subsystem. You don't really need to worry too much about this, but there is a folder called home, and then there should be a folder with the username that you chose when you were setting up Linux. So I'm going to double click on that. Now this is my home folder inside of the Linux subsystem. Some things that might look familiar, we have SSH. One of the things that the setup script did was set up an SSH key for us. This is where it put that stuff. It also used the Node Version Manager, or NVM. That is here as well. It modified a couple files like bashrc or bash profile or whatnot, and those are here all within the Windows subsystem for Linux. Now this home folder for my Linux user, Bob, is where I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it development. And this development folder is where I'm going to put every single one of my web development projects. Now it was pretty annoying to get all the way down here. If I needed to do this a whole bunch, I would probably get tired of it. So what I'm going to do is go back to the Bob folder, and you'll see it put development in an alphabetical order here. And I'm going to right click and say pin to quick access. This way I can just quickly get there by clicking the icon in my quick access bar here in the file explorer. So let's say inside of my development folder, I chose to make a folder for, I don't know, some project that I'm working on. Just as if this were normally in my Windows file system, I can just open this in Visual Studio Code. So if I open VS Code, open folder, development, some project, select folder, And just like in any other project, maybe this is where I create my index.html, and I want to create my styles.css. Okay, and now if I go back to my file explorer here and go into my sum project, those are being created just like they normally would. Now, if I go to Visual Studio Code and I open my terminal, let me make this big, you'll see that the location in the terminal it gives me is the path to this project. However, it's relative to the Windows subsystem for Linux. This tilde means the home directory, and that is the home directory that I showed you before with the username of Bob. This home directory in the Windows subsystem for Linux terminal is this tilde. Okay, so let's look at the next thing. Let's say you're maybe not interested in using the terminal that's built inside of Visual Studio Code for whatever reason. I'm going to close that out and we'll close Visual Studio Code. We downloaded earlier the Windows terminal, and what I've done is I've pinned it to my start menu, or my bar down here, the taskbar, and you can open it just by clicking your Windows and typing in Windows terminal. And then before just clicking it, you can right click and say pin to taskbar. Mine says unpin because it's already there. Now when I open this, it's defaulting to the Windows PowerShell. And the Windows PowerShell, like we saw earlier, is putting me in the Windows file system. We saw how I can click this drop down and go to Ubuntu to be put in the regular PowerShell. And in just a second, we're going to see how I can just make it so that Ubuntu is the automatic choice. But before we get there, I wanted to show this off. We'll see that it is defaulting us into kind of this strange directory that says /mnt/c/users/bob. This directory that looks kind of funny actually represents my Windows home folder. Inside of the Linux subsystem, there's a folder on the root directory called mnt, inside of which there's a directory called C. And this C folder or directory represents my whole hard drive for my actual Windows machine. So just like we were able to get into the Linux subsystem by diving into kind of this whole mess of folders, from the Linux subsystem, I'll click here on Ubuntu, they have also tried to make it possible to access your Windows files from within Linux. So here is the mount directory, which has a C directory, and apparently I can't do it right now within this window, but the point is that gives me access to all of the regular files on my normal Windows machine. Just like we did in PowerShell earlier, I can cd onto my desktop and I can list all the things there. And here we have like our shortcut links to Visual Studio Code, which is this right here, and Microsoft Edge and so forth. However, we kind of just talked about how we really don't want to be accessing Windows files from within our Linux subsystem. So we are going to make a couple quick changes to the Windows terminal program and make it so that, first of all, when we open it like this, that it will just default not to PowerShell, but to this Windows subsystem for Linux Ubuntu shell. That way we don't always have to click a drop down and go to it in order to do anything. The next thing we're going to do is change this starting directory to be the Linux home directory instead of the Windows home directory. And that way we don't even have to think twice about it. We will automatically be accessing the files in our Linux home directory. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click this drop down arrow, and one of the options here is settings. Now this will actually open the global settings in a JSON file. Don't be too scared by this. One thing I did notice when I was practicing this is as soon as I make a change here and save it, my Windows terminal kind of freaks out. So I'm just going to close this program. And you'll see an option here called default profile, and it's this kind of crazy string. If you look down here, it corresponds to the different options. And here, Windows PowerShell is the default profile. It's using this unique identifier string here. If I scroll a little bit down, there's one here that's called Ubuntu, and the source is the Windows subsystem for Linux terminal. So all I need to do is copy this unique identifier string and come up to default profile and replace this. Okay, I can hit save. You have to make sure you don't get rid of your comma or any of these other characters. And now the last thing I think I need to do is to go down to the object here that represents my WSL terminal, my Ubuntu terminal, and I'm going to add a new option here. So this is really important to get exactly right. I'm going to hit comma to start a new line here, and in double quotation marks I'm going to put in an option for starting directory. Now mine had that option automatically pre-fill, and what I'm going to put in here is the address or the directory to my Linux home directory. I could type this out, but I found that if I open my File Explorer, go to the development thing that I pinned, and go back to Bob, this represents my home directory. If you click this down arrow, it will give you a string that represents the path to that directory. I'm going to copy this and paste it inside of these quotation marks, but I need to change all of my backslashes to forward slashes. So I could do that manually, or in Visual Studio Code, if you just highlight one of them and hit Control D, it will highlight all of them. And then I'll just type the forward slash once and changes all of those to forward slashes. Make sure to save this file. I have mine set to automatically save after 1 second. I will close these settings. I can close my File Explorer, and I'm going to open my Windows terminal, and look at that. Awesome. My default shell has been changed to Ubuntu, and this tilde, like I said, represents my Linux home directory. So if I do a list, I'll see that development folder. I can cd into development and list it out and see my some project folder. Now I think I mentioned this earlier, but if you are here in your terminal, you can quickly open a file or a folder by saying code space and then the name of the folder or file you want to open. In my case, I'm in the development folder and there's a some project folder, so I'm saying, hey Visual Studio Code, open the some project folder. I hit enter and it opens Visual Studio Code with the some project folder already as the open folder. But once again, if you're not already using the Windows terminal, you could either open Visual Studio Code and choose open folder. You could use your new pinned item here and right click and say open with code. These are all legitimate ways to just open this in VS Code. Again, I understand that this might be super confusing, especially if you're not used to using the terminal or anything like that, but with just a little bit of time, I think you'll become pretty good at this. I think adding this quick access icon makes a huge difference. And of course, there's nothing stopping you from adding other pinned items or quick access items here. If you maybe have a really nested project folder that you're working pretty intently on, you could pin that to your quick access so you don't have to be diving through it in the Windows File Explorer like this. With all of that set up, I think you are ready to really jump in and start doing your web development on your Windows machine. Nice work sticking out through the whole tutorial here on the setup. I know it's complicated. Again, if you have any questions or any concerns, if you run into any problems at all, make sure to reach out to your instructor to get some help. Thanks everyone for your time, and we'll be seeing you soon.